Thank you so much to the organising committee for inviting me. I feel very privileged to be able to be here in this beautiful place and with such great organisation. I also thought it was very inspiring to hear our keynote speaker this morning, and I would like to thank you because you remind us academics of why we do this work, and you prevent us from being drowned in the theoretical, which we all, I think, are interested in, but it's a reminder of the practical side of why we do this work. So hopefully we can put our minds together and come up with better responses and prevention. So today I'm going to talk about barriers to implementing R2P effectively, but I'm going to look at a not often looked at sort of context, which is really the P3, but I'm going to focus on the UK, so looking at the West more. And I think similar to Sam, what I want to say is that, you know, R2P is often blamed as this norm that it's supposed to help people, but it's the people behind the norm that count. And just as we see murder is still committed, even though we have statutes or common law against murder, it's still committed and it still happens. So I don't think it's worth throwing out the framework. And in fact, in a lot of my research and work in different foreign offices, the need to have a framework to rely on to help pave the way in terms of response is very important and often looked to first. I think part of the problem with R2P is that it's soft law, so oftentimes lawyers working in foreign departments are looking for law, which, you know, arguably is not much harder than the soft law, since we're still dealing with that horizontal system. But in any case, these frameworks are quite important. So I'm going to narrow down to the domestic today. Could you do the next slide, please? I think it's not responding to me. Thank you. So I'll just give a quick, brief overview of kind of where we're at today. And I'll be very quick about my theoretical approach, and only because it lends itself to the empirical study that this research is based on. I'll talk about just R2P very briefly and how it applies to Syria during the time period I looked at. And then I'll look at kind of the context of that time when I put the research together. What was the problem and what was the question? Why was I asking that? And then how I went about answering that, the empirical side of it, who I talked to, and so forth. I'll share the findings, which is about the UK's understanding and implementation of R2P and the effects of that understanding, which we see today. So I am not completely finished with the Security Council. I do think there is hope, but I think it requires a lot of reflection on the domestic aspect of how we implement so-called norms. And then finally, some conclusions and where I'm looking to go with the study in future, and then some sort of policy recommendations that I would make to the UK Foreign Office, but also more broadly to other states. Next slide, please. Okay, so the overview is just that more recently, the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect and the Asia Pacific Center for the Responsibility to Protect put out a framework for action for the responsibility to protect, and it was seen as a resource for states. It's a great document. It helps states to understand how they can do a better job of realizing or operationalizing R2P. And during the launch, the Ambassador Fiona Webster from Australia mentioned that 2022 had been the deadliest year since the Rwandan genocide, but that commitment to R2P remained high. Rebecca Barber said that bit. And that was pretty much seen as evidence that the UN General Assembly has re-endorsed its commitment to R2P repeatedly. Right, so this idea that R2P is still quite important, but yet we are seeing the deadliest year. And thank you for your numbers, because those help support that dichotomy, that problem, and that question of whether prevention and response have stalled or even failed. So what I'm going to talk about is accountability for how states are understanding and practicing R2P. And as I said before, the traditional focus is on Russia and China, but not so much on France, the UK, or the US, and how they possibly obstruct consensus on very basic things, such as humanitarian aid, crossing borders, and so forth, which is some research that's been done by Jason Ralph and Jess Gifkins. Next slide, please. So in kind of keeping in that framework, what you see if you look at kind of norm theory and how we look at how norms travel into the domestic sphere. So, you know, bringing it from the international to the domestic, what happens in the domestic? How are those norms realized? And so this research used or adopted Acaria's kind of perspective known as critical constructivism, but it applied it in a new context, which was based on Western localization of R2P. So when I say localization, it's about how a norm travels into the domestic arena of a state, right? How it's understood, how it's implemented, and how does that norm come to be comfortable with competing domestic norms, right? In the hierarchy of different norms, every state has them. The research up until this point had very much been about post-colonial or authoritarian states and how these sort of Western perceived norms travel through those domestic arenas and kind of have to find a place within sometimes, you know, highly competitive norms in the national context. And I thought during this time, well, I don't think it's very different in the West, right? This presumption and this perception, the absence of Western localization of R2P sort of suggested this presumption that the West automatically incorporates or implements human rights-based norms without a thought, right? That they just naturally become part of the system. And so I set out to look at that and see if that was actually true. And really, this is because of the context at this time. We were looking at what was, you know, the outbreak of the Syrian war in 2011, and we were seeing the displacement of large numbers of people. And we were seeing a very lukewarm, to put it mildly, reception by the West to those fleeing mass atrocities, you know, and even on a lower level, if you can make a hierarchy, persecution, of course, in terms of the definition of refugee. So the question became, you know, how is the West sort of practicing its R2P? How does it understand it? So I used that framework that was often put into these post-colonial or authoritarian states and said, well, let's look at it from the Western perspective. What if we apply it there? And then, you know, having done that, the research that's come from that is very much about the impact of those understandings, and particularly when you're talking about those understandings from very powerful liberal states that sit as permanent members on the UN Security Council, and how does that affect consensus, norm building, but also practice on the ground. And then finally, just a note that when you take a critical constructivist viewpoint and you adopt that framework, you don't tend to look at the effects of it on the ground, right? It's highly theoretical, and it can, you know, I think too easily be used as not necessarily an excuse, but it's a justification of why a state maybe doesn't practice that norm in a particular way. But I think we have to push further, and what Jason Ralph's been talking about recently is we have to ask whether people, you know, states, are they being responsible in how they respond? So the effects of that understanding and implementation of norms is extremely important on the world stage. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, just to briefly, I think most people here have a somewhat understanding of R2P and paragraphs 138 and 139. But part of this research, just to say, is that the focus of the third pillar is actually that all member states agreed to use diplomatic, humanitarian, and other peaceful means to help protect populations from mass atrocities in a manifestly failing state. So I think the key here is that there is an agreement to use peaceful measures before you use any other measure. And that's an affirmative responsibility. They have agreed to use those, right? So I was interested in that aspect of Pillar 3. And then I wanted to look at how R2P and the refugee context overlap. Because as I said, we were building up to 2015, which is usually called the European refugee migrant crisis, and wanted to put that in context of R2P in terms of responsibility. So R2P is the operational norm. Mass atrocities were occurring in Syria. We know that the state was manifestly failing to protect its population, not its civilians, but its populations. It's very broad. Any population that finds itself in the territory comes under R2P. So we know that the state was manifestly failing because it is the main perpetrator of mass atrocities in that context. And then the question, we're seeing a lot of flows of people, those IDPs, internally displaced persons that remain within the borders of Syria, and also a lot of refugees in the region, and then some eventually, because they could not get enough aid or any kind of more long-term sort of response in the region, started traveling west towards Europe. Next slide, please. So the practical problem was to ask, what are the state responsibilities for refugees fleeing mass atrocities? And I wanted to understand, what does the UK think about that responsibility? How would it contextualize its responsibility to Syrians fleeing mass atrocities? R2P obviously is the operational norm in the mass atrocity context, and in the context of refugees, it's operational in terms of persecution, because of course refugees are fleeing their state of origin, their country of origin, due to persecution on the convention grounds. So part of this research was about how do these two protection norms work together complementarily. The scope was, the period was 2014 to 2016, and that was specifically because there was a lot of change in terms of the UK. The UK had pretty much had, it does not have a great record of providing refugee protection. It's usually an ad hoc response. It tends to prefer resettlement, which is a norm. It is not asylum. The seeking of asylum is a hard law aspect, but in order to seek asylum, the asylum seeker has to access the territory of the state party to the Refugee Convention. And as we see in Europe and in the UK, we see that externalization of the border occurring. So it's much harder for asylum seekers to even access that territory, which is actually the requirement in order to seek asylum. So in the case of the UK, they established, as a response to civil society pressure eventually, and the unfortunate pictures that came out of Aylan Kurdi, the little toddler who was trying to flee with his family and did not make it. In that context, there was quite a lot of outrage from the public and from NGOs and civil society in the UK, and therefore it changed policy. And the UK came out with its UK resettlement scheme, which is now, was finally opened up to the whole MENA region, but also now is the UK General Resettlement Scheme, which is the largest resettlement scheme the UK's had. So it might be small in terms of numbers and, you know, contribution, you know, against other states that host far more refugees. But in terms of the UK, at least it is moving in the direction of, you know, increasing resettlement. Of course, that is at a cost of asylum seeking, because resettlement, of course, is a norm, and the state can cherry pick from the region which refugees it would like to host. But I could talk about that on a whole other conference. So we'll carry forward with the other material. So part of the inquiry also is to look at how NGOs and civil society what sources of responsibility they were using to advocate for states to increase refugee protection during this time. Was that an R2P responsibility? And, you know, the ultimate overarching question is, why are these protection norms so siloed and separate when they are essentially overlapping in context, and different people practice different frameworks? So, and then finally about the impact of the UK's localization of R2P and how that impact feeds the sort of understanding and localization of civil society's advocacy also for the BRICS and also at the UN Security Council. Next slide, please. So the method was doctrinal and empirical. I come from a socio-legal background, so not as much an IR background as some of my colleagues. So I looked very much at the structures and frameworks and how they overlap. That's the doctrinal side. And that was to really look at those two different frameworks. And then empirically, I did a broad discourse analysis of all the official statements that came out from the UK government officials and Parliament, the Home Office, the FCO and DFID. At the time, this was before the DFID and the FCO had merged into the FCDO, which is what it is today. And then I also looked at international organizations such as UNHCR as the largest hosting. How are they advocating? Do they draw on R2P as a source of protection for refugees? Why don't they? Or why do they? Not to give away the answers. And then finally, funneled down to UK civil society in terms of what are the actual civil society organizations in London. Most of them are based in London. How are they advocating to government in terms of responsibility? What frameworks are they using? Next slide, please. And so then I followed up that broad discourse analysis with semi-structured interviews to inquire about the absence of certain responsibilities. So it was sort of a reverse kind of, asking officials, do you know what R2P means, but without saying what R2P is. So it was very much broadly having to say, what sources of responsibility do you rely on when you think about helping Syrian refugees, hint, hint, refugees. But having to sort of, and then finally with some ministers not even mentioning R2P, kind of at the end having to say, well, what about R2P? What do you think about it? Why aren't you using that? And so essentially the findings were that there were varied UK responses in terms of this time period. And I can broadly say that all of the departments interviewed did not see a real relationship between refugee protection and R2P. And what they saw more was that R2P is about ending mass atrocities, which is a wonderful aspiration, of course, and that is what, is the strong underlying aspiration of R2P, but if you look at the wording of R2P, it is actually pretty watered down because it's using these peaceful measures to help protect, not to protect, right? It's helping to protect. So pretty much anything fits within helping to protect, right? It's quite a minimal duty, really. So, it was pleasant to see that there was UK support for all the R2P principles, but largely the finding was that R2P needs to end mass atrocities, which is a big ask, right? Because it's people that end mass atrocities. But that's what it's about, but also that it is not linked to refugee protection, even though there was a response in the Home Office for Syrian refugees under the resettlement program. And the reason was, is one of my colleagues said today, was part of it is R2P is confirmed as an in loci response. That means a response in the region. It's a foreign policy response. And interestingly, a Home Office, of course, is a domestic-facing agency. However, it is dealing in the context of migration, which is a very international thing. So that kind of idea of joining those up is quite important. Also, the more impactful understanding, potentially impactful understanding, was that R2P is really just about intervention. So I'm sorry to say that my research confirmed that the understanding broadly in the UK, and I did not interview the entire UK, of course, but the broad understanding is that that is a norm about intervention, humanitarian intervention. It is going back to a Blairite understanding of that, a Kosovo understanding, that is what R2P is. Now, interestingly, during this time, Parliament was utilizing and had a discourse around R2P about wanting intervention and trying to leverage that intervention. And I don't know if everyone recalls, I think it was Tony Benn's passionate speech about joining the coalition at that time and so forth. So R2P was used very much in Parliament's calls for intervention, military intervention, whereas in the FCO and DFID to some degree, DFID really wanted to distance itself from R2P, but the Foreign Office and DFID were very, very strongly inclined to never mention R2P because they did not want to be dragged into an intervention. So what they saw as what needed to be a diplomatic response was very much worrisome. They did not want another Libya. So as Sam said this morning, the specter of Libya hangs darkly in the sort of shadows for R2P still today. And I know that academics have been talking about Libya for a long time, but I think the problem is that practitioners are not talking about it, and sometimes we need to be accountable and talk about those lessons and sort of, rather than let them gain strength in the shadows, we need to take them out and talk about them. So next slide, please. So, and when we say contestation, quite a theoretical term, we mean resistance, right? So Jennifer Welsh, a former special advisor to R2P at the UN, said in 2013 that resistance to a norm is revealed by how actors resist particular features or forward alternative approaches to the norm. So to cut a long story short, the issue that comes up here is that the UK has predominantly really just pruned the norm to just be about intervention. Now, that's also why it's distanced itself from it. So it's not that it wants it to be about intervention necessarily. It understands it to be that way and therefore has distanced itself domestically from it. There is no dedicated real office to R2P. There is no real mass atrocity prevention or response. It's not been institutionalized domestically, right? As many of us that work in the UK know, mass atrocity prevention and response is still very much subsumed by conflict prevention. And as we know, identity-based violence can occur during times of peace, right? Of course they can. So we're missing that prevention aspect. So that is a problem. So essentially, the sort of pruning of R2P to just be about intervention, and this is sort of distilled and realized by the fact that the UK was practicing several aspects of peaceful responses, but they were delinked from R2P because of that political reason and because of Libya. So the UK is maybe morally deficient as it might have been in terms of its refugee response. It was not linking its resettlement. It was not linking its humanitarian aid within the region to R2P, which are clearly tools for R2P. So next slide, please. So Akaria talks a lot about how norms can be modified at the domestic level and then fed back to the international level, and that can actually strengthen a norm. But the question of that, which is interesting because that sort of contradicts the idea that localization, we don't look at the effects of how norms are actually localized and understood under that sort of theoretical framework. But there is no talk about what happens if a norm is modified at the domestic level and then feeds back, and how can it weaken that norm. And I think to some degree that's what this research is really about. And it can't be taken without the context of other responses by the UK. So the UK is kind of selective. It has selectively misapplied R2P's explicit content around peaceful measures, is in favor of R2P's most controversial aspect, the military intervention aspect, which is also the particular part of R2P that is so highly contested in the global south, right? And actually Brazil and China came up with responsibility while protecting and responsible protection, which would have added additional checks to the use of military force under R2P. But these were rejected by the UK. So the rejection of those additional checks in the context of also understanding and implementing R2P as military interventions suggests, a problem. And then ultimately, how does that feed, the lack of consensus at the UN Security Council level? And who loses? Ultimately, those people fleeing mass atrocities lose. And as Sam was talking about prevention, and I think so is Thomas a little bit about prevention discourse. Next slide, please. That's just my 2-minute warning. So in terms of, I should say a little bit before I move to the conclusion, but I also had to look at how civil society, what's the impact for civil society in terms of how it advocates to the UK government in terms of finding more space for refugee protection, but particularly people fleeing mass atrocities, not necessarily just persecution. So the larger humanitarian organizations that are international, generally they've, pretty publicly withdrawn their public support of R2P. And that's due to that conflation with military intervention, which they feel feeds that sort of imperialist doctrine, right? It also seriously affects their field operations in terms of the Holy Trinity, right? Independence, impartiality, and neutrality in the field. So when you militarize aid and so forth, you have problems in the field. And then, interestingly, UK civil society underwent kind of reformatted, sort of modified R2P, and they basically reframed it and kind of rebrand it to a particular language to get policy traction from UK government advocacy. So they're sort of telling the government what they want to hear in terms of what R2P is a little bit, just to get in the room, right? Because ultimately their whole purpose and raison d'etre is to get protection for people on the ground. So if they have to rebrand R2P to protection of civilians, then they're going to do it. So I'll leave that for now, because of course that's going down another rabbit hole as well. But I think what was interesting here was the fact that in terms of the civil society approach, what you see is government policy sort of informing civil society advocacy to a certain degree. And we generally see, that it's civil society that tends to hopefully inform, government policy and practice. But in this case, it was, and I suppose this fits within the wider context of civil society shrinking space, the sort of democracy. We have the same challenges in the very far West in terms of lefty lawyers. We see a lot of discourse about lefty lawyers and civil society. So I presume, to this effect, civil society is just trying to get in the room sometimes because they have a greater purpose, which is protection. Next slide, please. So to just boil this down to the conclusion, then, we have to look at accountability closer to home. There's certainly been a paralysis in Syria. I think, interestingly, it sums up quite well what this research was the research done by Ralph and Gilgan on humanitarian aid access, that the UK is often the pen holder on these resolutions, these humanitarian resolutions. And at the time, during this period of time, those resolutions were being rejected by Russia and China, so aid was not even getting into the border. But unfortunately, if you actually look at the resolutions and aid was always tied to political transition and democracy building, really. And the thing with a resolution is that once that passes, it's a legally binding framework, and it is seen as something that you can intervene on based on non-compliance with a resolution. So from a P2 perspective, after Libya, and there were many statements put out about that never again will we roll over for regime change. So obviously the danger of attaching that to aid made it much slower for aid to get in. And eventually, when those things were delinked and actually a new pen holder was involved, I think it was Jordan at the time, we saw aid start to get into Syria. So how these resolutions are drafted is important and what they're attached to. And I think also just the point on everyday human rights violations we know can lead to mass atrocities, but the likelihood of having that be part of the sort of R2P agenda is highly unlikely, because our legal frameworks would not allow intervention based on anything less than mass atrocities, and even that's impossible to go in for that right now. Notwithstanding the fact that maybe military intervention isn't the best answer anyway, but the point is that there's no way states would be willing to even have those conversations if states like the UK traditionally see military intervention as a proper response for mass atrocities, then what would keep it from seeing it as a response to everyday human rights violations? Right, so there's some accountability there for non-consensus, and I think this is just part of the whole context. The other thing is that the UK. In having this sort of understanding of R2P allows a further smokescreen to the P2 to cover up whatever sort of human rights violations are ongoing there, because they can, always claim the hypocrisy card. And the fact that the P3 are not being held to account is problematic, because it allows that smokescreen to carry on. Next slide, please. And then I didn't get to talk much about the UNHCR, but if anyone's interested in that, feel free to bring that up in the questions. But basically, there's the non-coercive responses that do help to protect that the UK was implementing were delinked from R2P. And I talked about the impact on those, and you can see that on the slide. I think that further study-wise, I'm currently writing a book on this and adding the additional case study of the US in terms of the US understanding of R2P and to see how that measures up. It is not vocal about it being about humanitarian intervention at all. It seems to have a different understanding of the legality around that from the UK, but it'll be interesting to uncover if that's still what they think. Next slide, please. And then I'll also look at the public understanding. So recommendations, just in terms of the UK case studies, is just up on the slide. So clearly we need to educate states a little bit more on the broader remit of R2P to help build trust and consensus. We have a full range of R2P protection methods, and those need to be integrated across government. We need to de-escalate R2P's kind of norm resistance, right, by building trust and credibility. And that means linking, it's a very minimal policy shift for the UK in many countries to say that we are, you know, resettling refugees because that is our responsibility to protect. And, you know, rather than having this look like some kind of constraining factor, because each case is a case-by-case basis, you know, it's, like I said, it's a minimal policy shift to things that are already occurring. But it also advances that conversation around R2P that it is not just about military intervention. I also think it's important to understand that the Home Office is also relevant to you know, world, international sort of, you know, efforts to prevent and respond to mass atrocities, right? We have multiple protection frameworks, they're overlapping and they're too siloed and need to be considered. I didn't get to talk about UNHCR, but you know, within their advocacy, they stay well away from R2P as well. So there's a huge fear around R2P. And then finally, this idea of consistency and accountability across cases, that mass atrocities are always illegal and they should warrant at least a conversation about how to prevent and respond. Okay, and the last slide, please. So if you wanted to ever read about the different aspects, they're sort of divided across papers. So thank you so much.